All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for today's Rare Disease Congressional Caucus briefing. My name is James Valentine, and it's an honor to moderate this important discussion on the theme of rare disease, regulatory urgency, and therapeutic opportunity. By way of background, I work with both biopharma companies and patient advocacy organizations to help navigate complex paths of new drug development and approval. For the last 17 years, my focus has been championing the patient voice as part of that process. Earlier in my career, during my time at FDA, I had the privilege of helping to build and launch the Patient-Focused Drug Development Initiative, an effort that helped to shape how the agency ensures that patients have a voice and integrates their perspectives into regulatory decision-making. That experience continues to ground my work today, which is why it's particularly my honor to help moderate this conversation. On behalf of the rare disease community, I would like to thank our Congressional Caucus members and co-chairs, Senators Amy Klobuchar and Roger Wicker, and Representatives Doris Matsui and Gus Bilirakis. And I also would like to thank the rare disease community supporters of this Congressional Caucus briefing. For those of you working on behalf of members of Congress, I want to start by grounding what regulatory urgency and therapeutic opportunity means. More than 30 million Americans are living with a rare disease. For most of them, there are no FDA-approved treatments. Families live every day with the urgency of time, because every day without therapy is a day of lost health, lost potential, or even lost life. At the same time, rare diseases represent one of the greatest areas of therapeutic opportunity. Over half of the drugs approved by FDA in recent years have been for rare diseases, and small and mid-sized biotech companies, often US-based, are carrying large amounts of risk to bring these therapies forward. Their success depends on a regulatory system that is both rigorous and responsive. There's been real progress to recognize. FDA has established initiatives like the Rare Disease Innovation Hub, designed to coordinate expertise across centers and improve consistency in rare disease reviews. The agency has also launched the Support for Clinical Trials Advancing Rare Disease Therapeutics, better known as the START pilot program, which provides selected sponsors with more frequent advice and enhanced communication from FDA staff. Another important step is the new CDER-CBER Rare Disease Evidence Principles, which propose a framework for considering non-traditional sources of evidence in rare conditions with very small populations and urgent unmet need. Added to this are the FDA leadership's efforts to explore pathways to consider plausible mechanisms of action when traditional data may be limited. These are important signals that the agency recognizes the need to adapt. But what we're hearing from the community, what patients and sponsors are experiencing on the ground, suggests that there is still a gap between aspiration and reality. On one hand, FDA leadership speaks often of flexibility, innovation, and urgency. On the other hand, in day-to-day reviews, we are seeing slowdowns and an increased uncertainty in decision-making. Companies report different interpretations across divisions, and the application of regulatory flexibility, which Congress intended in laws like accelerated approval and orphan drug provisions, remain inconsistent in practice. The challenge now is to ensure that the intent in policy and leadership statements carries through into the daily decisions that determine whether a therapy moves forward or stalls. Patients and companies need predictability, they need transparency, and they need confidence that FDA will apply flexibility consistently across centers and across time. Achieving that requires not only clear policy direction, but also the resources and staffing that allow review teams to put those principles into practice, so that the aspirations expressed at the leadership level are fully translated into the decisions that matter most for patients. This is why congressional attention is so important. Through its oversight and legislative role, Congress can help to ensure that FDA has the tools, resources, and accountability to follow through on its commitments. One example of where this attention matters is the upcoming reauthorization of the user fee acts, including PDUFA. These reauthorizations are not just procedural renewals. They create opportunities to invest and reinvest in programs that directly support rare diseases and review at the agency, whether by expanding expertise, improving interdivision coordination, or strengthening communication with sponsors and patients. Congressional engagement can make the difference between aspiration and real progress. Congress and FDA have already laid much of the groundwork. The 21st Century Cures Act, the Rare Pediatric Disease Priority Review Voucher Program, patient-focused drug development, all reflect bipartisan recognition that rare disease development is different and patients must have a central voice. As we transition to hearing from our patient advocate panelists here today, I want to make one specific request to you. Please support FDA engaging with patient community leaders in the same sustained and formal way that Commissioner McCary and senior leadership have engaged with industry CEOs through listening sessions. Patient leaders bring unique perspective, not only the lived reality of what their communities are facing, but also the broad view of all drugs in development for their disease, what worked, what failed, and what were the regulatory roadblocks that arose. Their insights are indispensable if the system is truly to reflect the urgency before us and translate opportunity into therapies that reach patients. Because in the end, the measure of success here is not just how many drugs are approved. It's whether parents living with retinitis pigmentosa can continue seeing their children's faces and smiles, whether individuals with microcystic lymphatic malformations can avoid recurrence and the need for difficult, repeated surgeries, whether patients with spinocerebellar ataxia can maintain the ability to navigate everyday obstacles, and with those living with APAP can breathe easily enough to enjoy everyday activities, all so they can have longer, healthier lives. Whether American innovation in rare disease continues to thrive depends on a regulatory environment that is supportive, consistent, and clear. So, as we begin today's discussion, I encourage you to listen closely to the patient stories, the scientific challenges, the policy opportunities, and I ask that you carry the message back to your office. Every day matters for rare disease patients and families. The urgency is real, the opportunity is enormous, and with the right focus, FDA, Congress, patients, and innovators together can change what is possible for rare disease. Thank you, and with that, let's turn to our panel. So I'd first like to introduce Emily Milligan, who is the Executive Director of the Barth Syndrome Foundation. Emily is an advocate dedicated to improving the lives of people through better health and social equity. Emily.
All right. Can you all hear me okay? Okay. Good afternoon, and thank you for being here. It means a lot to us. Jalen is an adorable baby boy from Omaha, Nebraska, who was born fighting for his life. He spent his earliest days in intensive care, hooked up to many machines, his tiny body struggling against an ultra-rare genetic disorder that most of his doctors had never even heard of. It's Barth syndrome. In short, Barth syndrome is life-robbing, stealing roughly 50% of our children's lives before their 5th birthday. Too well, losing a son and a brother to this very same disease. They were asked to sign a DNR, and yet they held on to hope. For Jalen, hope had a name, and that was an investigational drug named elamipretide. Now on drug through emergency access for nearly a year and a half, Jalen is a happy and healthy toddler who is thriving and loves pickles. His story is not an isolated medical miracle, though. There's Josiah from New Jersey, Declan from Arizona, Gilby from my home state of Colorado. There's also those fortunate enough to make it to adulthood with Barr syndrome. Walker from Georgia, Jacob and Christopher from Mississippi, and many others. Jalen's story and the stories of families like his provide compelling testimony of the life-saving and improving benefits of this therapy. Their stories are valid, vital data points that tell us what traditional statistics alone cannot. That a therapy has meant all the difference between the fear of death and despair of yesterday and life and hope of today. Taken together, the data and the testimonies reinforce one another. And when they do, they create a body of evidence far stronger than numbers alone. We must advance regulatory consideration of patient testimonies to be beyond anecdotes, but rather to be included as critical data in the comprehensive and thorough review of new drug applications. To do so, though, has been fraught with subjectivity and inconsistency across the FDA. And in today's times, I want to specifically acknowledge that this is not a partisan issue. This is a regulatory matters concern that has spanned across 4 administrations in our experience. And it's clearly exemplified by those here alongside me that this is not unique to Barr syndrome. What our journey was, though, is in 2018, we held our externally led patient-focused drug development meeting with the FDA. And over the next 5 years, we held 4 listening sessions, 4 different review division assignments, over 80 Barth experts signing on to letters of support for this therapy, and nearly 20,000 people signing on to a community petition. That's just some of what we've done. The years of advocacy have culminated in a 10-6 positive advisory committee vote in favor of the therapy last year, with FDA-selected committee members also saying they would have voted in favor if the specific question had been phrased just a little differently. And yet, the NDA was CRL'd, meaning it was not approved, in May. The request for reconsideration rejected in July, and a new NDA accepted in August, but with a Class 2 designation, the longer of the 2 possible review periods. I want to footnote that we are hopeful, though, that the FDA will render a decision perhaps as soon as this month. But that's over 7 years. 7 years that our families have laid their lives bare, shed tears testifying to some of their hardest days, in hearing rooms and on Zoom, in the hope that their voices would matter. We all of us here, want safe and effective therapies. What we are talking about is how that determination is made. For us in this product, safety has not been an issue, thank goodness. The enormous challenge, though, has been proving efficacy according to traditional standards designed for large patient populations that we definitionally do not meet, nor can we. Today, we know of 28 people in this therapy through the Expanded Access Program, most of those in the US, and a large percentage of which are babies, like Jalen. Active consideration of published data that emerges from patients on expanded access as part of a new drug application review process offers yet another way to include additional relevant data to expedite access to the most vulnerable who have no other options. We ask you, as leaders in Congress, to ensure, in thinking about sensible policies to give and preserve young Americans' health today, that the FDA takes 2 critical steps, among others, but I want to call these out. First, avoid type 2 errors, false negatives that occur when therapies like ours actually do work, but are rejected simply because the statistics did not and cannot capture the full truth. Second, reject historical age step-down approval models that delay access for the youngest patients and balloon costs of products without considering a risk-benefit framework. Children like Jalen, born in cardiac distress, are born into a life of risk and uncertainty. We need streamlined regulatory approaches that don't deny children born today the possibility of tomorrow. Our families are not asking for shortcuts. They are asking for appropriateness, for urgency, and for recognition that their lived experiences are evidence that must be weighed alongside clinical data. Congress has the power to make sure their voices are not just heard, but acted upon. And for Jalen, and for so many like him with Barr syndrome, the action means everything, including life itself.
Thank you, Emily. Next, we have Jessica Haywood, who's the managing partner of Otter Creek Investments, but today she's here in her capacity as a board member of the Cure San Filippo Foundation. Jessica?
Good afternoon. Thank you to EveryLife and to the Rare Disease Caucus for having us today. I'm also aunt to a little girl named Sadie who has Sanfilippo syndrome. Sanfilippo syndrome, or MPS III, is an ultra-rare genetic condition that impacts the entire body. It's caused by an enzyme deficiency that results in the buildup of heparan sulfate. Over time, that heparan sulfate causes relentless progressive brain injury to the entire body. Children lose the ability to walk, to talk, to eat by mouth. They suffer seizures and many other things, and most die in their teenage years. Today, there are no approved treatments, but we're hopeful that that will change soon. And these two girls in this picture show, early stage of the disease and the late stage. Eliza at age 4 was very active, running around, and Isabel at age 11 was wheelchair bound. Unfortunately, Isabel passed away at age 14. So let's zoom out for a minute and look at the regulatory landscape. We've been monitoring the FDA's approvals and rejection of drugs over the last 5 months. And what we found is a little upsetting. 6 of 7 of the pediatric degenerative diseases have been delayed. Those are diseases like Sanfilippo, like Hunter syndrome, Barth syndrome. And these are all progressive diseases that impact the nervous system. CBER, which is the Center for Biologics that oversees cell and gene therapies, has rejected 64% of all drugs that have been publicly reported in the last 5 months. That seems like a pretty high rate of rejecting or delaying drugs. They've also issued significantly more CRLs, but I know Annie's going to talk about that in a little bit. Since May, accelerated approval has not been granted for rare diseases outside of rare cancers. Luckily, 67% of rare cancers have been given accelerated approval, but we're not seeing that match up in rare diseases. For Sanfilippo specifically, we have a promising gene therapy in development. It's called UX111 by Ultragenyx. And this drug has been in clinical trial for almost a decade. 28 children have gotten access to this drug. It's safe and effective, but unfortunately it was rejected in July. And it was due to manufacturing issues that were, in the grand scheme of things, pretty minor. And this was on the accelerated approval pathway using heparan sulfate as a well-accepted biomarker. Let's talk a little bit about the progression of Sanfilippo syndrome and why this delay is so harmful. This large chart shows what happens over time in Sanfilippo. So the black line is a neurotypical child. The blue line is a child with Sanfilippo. And you'll see that the lines start to diverge around age 2 when heparan sulfate begins building up in these children's bodies. By age 4, children with Sanfilippo syndrome are extremely hyperactive. By 6, most have lost the ability to talk. By 10, many have feeding tubes because they can no longer eat correctly. They have issues with choking and swallowing. If we compare this to the other chart, The blue line shows children that have been untreated, and the green line shows children that have been treated. And it's clear that children who have been treated are continuing to progress cognitively. We also know that children who have received this gene therapy are continuing to progress physically as well. For example, a 10-year-old, or several 10-year-olds actually, who have gotten this treatment early can still read, they can write, they can walk. Some are even playing softball. This is something that Sanfilippo families, including my own, could only dream of. So to give you a real-life example, I want to share a short video of my beautiful niece, Sadie, with her sweet Southern accent. Early in life, she was quite advanced. She was learning to spell before age 2, and she knew hundreds of words. But you'll see the impact of time and why these delays are so detrimental to our community.
What's this? And what does this say? What's your name?
What's your name? What's your name?
I just hate how lost she looks in the end. You know, we went in basically 6 months and didn't hear her say her name anymore. So this just shows the devastating nature of this disease, and I don't want Sanfilippo to steal speech or anything from any more kids, but if the FDA does not change, then more kids are going to lose abilities like Sadie.
What's this?
Oops. So the FDA delays are not just a moral and ethical failing, they're also an economic crisis. Delayed approvals cost the government more money. Families have to utilize more government programs. The lifetime family burden of Sanfilippo syndrome is $8 million per child in their shortened lifespan. This is due to extensive hospitalizations, medications, surgeries, therapies, you name it, and typically one parent has to leave the workforce to care for the child. And this is just one of 10,000 rare diseases. Every Life has published some research that shows that the annual economic burden for all 30 million Americans with rare diseases is $1 trillion a year. That's a year. Given that 95% of rare diseases don't have treatments, this is a substantial number. And unless the FDA starts using regulatory flexibility and pathways like accelerated approval, we're going to keep this extremely high burden. Additionally, these delays are having an impact on biotech companies. We're already hearing that some of these companies are leaving or moving overseas. We're not talking about big pharma in most of these rare diseases. We're talking about small pharma that simply does not have money to sustain these endless delays. So we need Congress to help us ensure that FDA has the resources, incentives, and structures to serve our children. We're asking that the FDA urgently review these resubmissions and other rare disease applications. The commissioner has said that reviews should take weeks and not months, so let's hold him to that. We also want to ensure that there's ongoing communication during the review process. We don't have to issue CRLs for minor manufacturing things. Let's work with sponsors during the process. We also want to make sure that there is consistent use of accelerated approval. As I've shown, this is clearly not happening right now. And lastly, we want the FDA to engage with families and advocates. We have submitted a letter with 45,000 signatures and 150 rare disease groups, and we still haven't heard from the commissioner on a meeting. So Commissioner McCary, please meet with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. Our next speaker is Kelly Brazo, who is the co-founder and CEO of Cure LGMD2I Foundation, which was established in 2011 after her daughter Samantha was diagnosed with limb-girdle muscular dystrophy 2I-R9. Kelly? That's up.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here, and thank you for having me. It's really an honor to represent our LGMD community. As James introduced, I am a mom of Sammy. She is 17 years old now, living with limb-girdle muscular dystrophy type 2I/R9. She was diagnosed at the age of 2, and at the time was a young, vibrant, typical little girl who loved to dance and sing and play in princess dresses. Since that time, over the last 15 years, she's suffered significantly through the loss of muscle strength of this disease. Thankfully, she's still walking. It's not an easy walk, but she can no longer get out of a chair by herself independently. She can't go to the bathroom by herself independently. She's lost a lot of quality of life. She's a senior in high school right now and would love to go to college next year, and we're trying to figure out how that can work with living with a disability. What is limb-girdle muscular dystrophy? It's actually, there are 30 subtypes of limb-girdle, and I'll say LGMD moving forward here in interest of time, but each subtype of the limb-girdle muscular dystrophies has its own known genetic subtype, genetic variant. All of them present with progressive weakness beginning in the hip and shoulder girdles and expand out over time. Many subtypes involve respiratory and cardiac complications with an eventual loss of ambulation. Currently, there are no approved therapies for any of the 30 limb-girdle subtypes, although we are an ideal candidate for many gene therapies that are coming to market for other diseases right now, in particular muscular dystrophies. So many of you have heard of Duchenne muscular dystrophy. It's a much more common form of muscular dystrophy, also known as DMD, and we have learned so much from that amazing community. We've been able to share a lot of the same scientific research and clinical experts throughout the field of muscular dystrophy. There are powerhouse advocacy organizations like PPMD and MDA and many others. And really, we've learned a lot through their drug development, and applications that they have learned are also relevant to many of the other neuromuscular diseases, including the LGMDs. And we've really learned a lot from them and has really tried to follow in their footsteps. So we have aligned ourselves with and many other limb-girdle patient advocacy organizations. And one thing I pride myself on is that we really work together as a collaborative community. The icons at the top are just a handful of the patient organizations. These are the ones that have been more impacted in the last few years. And we've worked together to develop standards of care. We have a newly created LGMD care guide. We have many natural history studies. In fact, my daughter's been in 3 natural history studies because one's just never enough. We have patient registries for many of the different subtypes. We've participated in patient listening sessions. We've done our ELPFDD several years ago. We even had the first scientific drug development workshop that we held with the FDA last February. We have many patient conferences. We've done educational webinars. We even have ICD-10 codes now for several of the subtypes. So we've really aligned ourselves in the perfect position to create drug development, and yet we're still waiting. Because our genetic subtypes are all known, we really are an ideal candidate for platform approaches, basket trials, and the accelerated approval approaches. And so, and now with a new plausible mechanism of action pathway that McCary has announced, that would also really fit nicely with the limb-girdle subtypes because each of them are ultra rare. When you combine all of the limb-girdle subtypes together, we are a much more common, but individually ultra rare. But sadly, over the last few months, we have had some program attrition. One company in particular recently dropped all but one of its limb-girdle subtype gene therapy programs, leaving families really desperate and really have lost hope. And we do have some interest from other smaller biotechs, but funding is really problematic right now in light of the PRV not having been reauthorized. And so I'm really here to ask and express the urgency of the reauthorization of the pediatric review voucher, also known within the Give Kids a Chance Act of 2025. Many of you know it's a bipartisan, market-based incentive with no cost to taxpayers that would really benefit our patient community. In fact, we have one company in particular right now that has approval to begin 2 clinical trials here in the United States. And we have investors that are ready to fill that bucket to help fund those trials. And right now, they're waiting for the PRV to be reauthorized so patients specific to 2 separate subtypes can be dosed. And we have a family, the Dion Foundation in particular, that is now self-funding that one of the 2 trials for LGMD2C because they can't afford to wait for the PRV to be reauthorized, and they've been fundraising like crazy to fund this trial themselves. No family should have to do that when we know that a simple approval of the PRV could help get some venture capitalists back interested for that incentive to continue. And as programs are being paused, muscles are wasting, and kids are losing, and their families are losing hope. Just recently, my daughter, Sammy, was interviewed for a magazine article, and she said to the interviewer, "I won't allow myself to imagine my future without gene therapy." We really want to see her walk across the stage at graduation in May. We don't know if that'll be possible. She's one fall away from a fracture that, well, typically kids stop walking with this disease not because of the general progression, it's usually because of a fall and a fracture that leads them to a wheelchair and they don't come back out. So with your action, Congress can make a difference and she won't have to wait. So thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, Kelly. Our last speaker is Annie Kennedy, who's the Chief of Policy, Advocacy, and Patient Engagement at the Every Life Foundation for Rare Diseases. And Annie may be known to many of you as a veteran leader in the rare disease patient-focused drug development movement. Annie?
Good afternoon. Thank you, everyone, for being here. My role here today is to sort of help provide the through line, because we've just heard from some incredible community leaders as to what's happening in just a few of our communities, but we're seeing this happen in many rare disease communities. And we know we've had many of our communities up here on the Hill talking to many of you about their experiences, and what we're hearing from many on the Hill that there is deep concern and a deep want to be involved, but just an interest in where are the opportunities to make an impact. So to provide just a little more context around this environment, this ecosystem, and where the rare disease community fits in, first and foremost, I think it's really important just to underscore that our rare disease community wants, needs, and deserves safe and effective therapies. And so we've worked alongside and thanks to the leadership of Congress and FDA for there to be infrastructure and pathways for rare disease therapeutic development that reflect that urgency in rare disease, but ensure that there's rigor that does not lower the threshold for safety and efficacy in rare disease, but ensures that we have pathways that move processes with timelines that reflect all of these rare diseases that are rapidly progressing, because we don't have time to wait. And we need therapies for this generation of patients, not those that are going to be born 10 or 15 years from now. And so you'll see on this slide that we have data that shows that it takes, on average, 15 years to develop a therapy and over $2 billion to develop one therapy. And in the rare disease space, we're often talking about very small biotechs, and again, rare diseases where we know that there are about 10% of Americans, and we think that's a conservative estimate, are living with rare diseases, more than 50% of whom are children, and many of them will not live to reach their 5th birthday. So with those stats, traditional models of therapeutic development don't fit and don't work. And this left-hand side here is where our therapeutic development paradigm is. So we go from research and early animal models and animal testing into clinical trials and FDA approval. And what we're talking about here today is really the left side of this paradigm. But it's not until we get to treatment that we actually start to have medicines, approved medicines, that people receive. And so we're focusing today on this clinical development and regulatory environment, but ultimately what we want are medicines that people can receive and take. And Jessica actually talked earlier about some health economic data that the Sanfilippo community has developed, but we do have health economic data specific to the broad rare community showing that it makes health economic sense for us to be developing these therapies because it is very expensive to live with a rare disease. So investing in therapy development is health economically is economically a sound investment as well. But let's talk a little bit about just a review timeline, again, for context, because we've been talking today, we've been hearing about what's been happening in this environment as we've been seeing delays and rejections in some decisions. And so just when we talk about what that looks like, this is an NDA is a new drug application, and I'm sure many in the room know that, but just to break that down. And this is your typical timeline for an NDA, which is a 10 to 12 month cycle. So this is as everything was going. I'm going to talk about is what we're seeing, because there's been radical transparency around the CRLs, or complete response letters. So I'm just going to talk about what we're seeing as far as trends in the CRLs. So we can share a little bit about what we know. Not as much those that have been released, but those that we're tracking overall from the agency. And just for context, again, making sure everyone understands, a CRL is not a rejection. So that's not that a product hasn't been approved, but it's an indication from the agency that there's more to discover. So that's an indication the agency says that it is not accepted in its present form, and typically it's an opportunity for a course correction between the company and the agency. There has to be a resubmission, but there's no guarantee that the resubmission will yield an approval. But here's what happens when there's a CRL. So that first timeline is that first light blue part. So that first slide then becomes that first light blue part. And the timeline then gets extended. So then just take the context of the presentations we've heard and the urgency of rare disease. And Jessica just showed a really compelling and poignant video of Sadie and the milestones that get lost in progressive neuromuscular diseases or rare diseases. And we then heard about a neuromuscular disease, limb-girdle. And these are diseases where every day, every month matters, and you don't get it back. And so when you have a CRL or you have a delay, you're not getting it back. You're not getting that time back. So what we're talking about in the rare disease community is we don't want products that don't work. And we don't want things to be approved that shouldn't be. But what we also don't want are unnecessary time delays, because we've worked really hard with Congress to make sure that there's infrastructure and that there are pathways that honor the urgency in rare disease. And so what we're asking for are timelines to be adhered to, first cycle product reviews, decisions that honor the urgency of rare disease. So here's what we're seeing in the CRLs that have come out. So this is January 1, 2024 through August 18, 2025. And this is from the pink sheet. And since this time, there have actually been 4 CRLs that have been issued that weren't in these graphics. 2 were in rare disease. And you can see overall there were 89 CRLs, and 35% of them were in CBER and 65% were in CEDAR. And for the sake of time, I'm just going to keep going. And then we've heard earlier today talking about that they were not all based on clinical issues, regulatory issues. And so again, that's something that we as a community are just really, again, eager to understand. Are there other ways to be clearing these up and cleaning these up without adding additional time to the timelines of the review cycles? And then we have further broken them down by which clinical categories these conditions fall into. So you can see sort of where that's happening within the review divisions. So our main takeaway for the community is that time is a precious commodity in rare disease, and we do not have extra time. And so where there are opportunities to ensure that we're honoring existing pathways, existing frameworks, we have patient-focused drug development frameworks that have come out of previous user fee engagements. We have requirements to use the totality of evidence to inform decision-making. We have requirements to include patient experience data in decision-making. We have requested that the commissioner meet with the patient community to better understand how to inform decision-making. We have applauded the engagement of the administration and of this new administration with biotech CEOs and biopharma CEOs, and we are really urging that similar engagement occur across the patient community. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Annie. And as Annie just mentioned, and as I noted in my remarks, I had asked you to support, to have FDA leadership engage with patient advocate leaders in that same way that they've engaged with CEOs as part of those listening sessions. I hope that today's presentations have shown you firsthand what that would provide to the agency, the value of hearing from patient advocate leaders and both expressing the challenges as well as the opportunities for regulatory flexibility and advancing new therapies. So with the remainder of our time, we'd like to have a panel discussion with our expert patient advocates here today. To start that off, my first question, and maybe we'll just work our way from my left to right for the first question, is we've heard from all of you in your remarks that the rare disease community has been advocating for greater predictability, consistency, and transparency. I'd like to know, what does that look like through your community's lens?
Yeah, so really, we just need to know what to expect. Drug companies want to go in knowing what to expect. You develop timelines, and we have to follow these timelines. We want to use tools that exist today, like accelerated approval. We can't just keep working off of this indefinite line because drug companies don't have the money for that. Patient groups certainly can't support that. We appreciate the intent of McCary releasing the CRLs recently to the transparency piece of your question. But they were so redacted that they weren't helpful. And, luckily, pharmaceutical companies in the rare disease space will sometimes share the CRLs with us directly so we understand what's happening. But, as far as creating transparency, if we could bring the patient voice into those meetings between the FDA and pharma, I think it would be really powerful.
Thanks for going first. So a couple of things. Our drug had a priority review designation. That takes usually around 6 months. We're at 20+ months right now. I don't have examples of consistency or predictability given this one case study of ours. So that is something that really needs to be shored up. If you have this designation, that is in direct recognition of the urgency of an indication and should be honored as such. I do want to acknowledge the administration, though, for starting to really look at accelerated approval in earnest. This is something we've been trying to talk about with them for years. Went down a one path, now we're back at that. I wish we would have had this conversation 4 years ago. But that is a great example of a pathway that is designed specifically for rare, that has been underutilized. Again, we've lost some time there, but I'm glad to see it back on the table, at least for rare. In regards to, thank you for this idea also, Jessica, the CRLs, that's a great gesture from FDA to release that information. We have better line of sight as to what they're saying. Annie just mentioned CRLs are not a stop. Sometimes functionally that's how it works. But I do think there's opportunities that have broader context because there's a lot of communications between sponsors and FDA that add color to why they rendered a certain decision. And I think it'd be helpful to see how the sponsors respond also, because that would really enable the patient community to have that line of sight.
Yeah, I would like to say with the accelerated approval pathway and the regulatory flexibility for us as an ultra-rare community with multiple subtypes that are having clinical trials right now, although the option to use real-world data and, natural history as a comparator, they're still using placebo arm. And they're getting, we as advocates are going to the companies saying, please, our patients can't afford to be on a placebo for 18 months, 3 years. We have patients on placebo. They're still getting blood draws. They're leaving work or school to get to the clinic. There's a lot of patient burden to be in these clinical trials, especially when you have a physical disability and the expense of having to do all that. And so although the tools are there, the FDA has to use them for conditions like limb-girdle muscular dystrophy that are ultra-rare, they're being, the companies are saying, but we're going to the FDA and they're advising us that we should still use a placebo arm. And so I think the breakdown in communication or the lack of guidance on how can they best, what are the tools that companies can use to feel more comfortable to utilize the tools that the FDA is saying, yes, we will look at external control arms rather than placebo arms, but yet they're not doing it because they're not being guided that's the best approach. So just like to see our patients not have to wait longer in a clinical trial for a treatment.
So I would say the first thing is I think we need to, first of all, support and buttress the existing pathways that we have and infrastructure that we have. So we need to reauthorize the pediatric rare disease priority review voucher. It's working, and we need to make sure that it continues to exist. I also think we are seeing out of the agency a lot of new programs that are signaling commitments to rare disease, and especially that are signaling a real interest in supporting the smaller populations within rare disease. That's incredibly important. But until we start to see approvals that are also reflecting some of the innovative models and innovative designs that are being discussed, it's really hard to send a signal to the companies and to the investors that we're committing also to these innovative models. So I think we have to both have the RISE workshops and talk about the guidances and then approve these products so that people have confidence in what we're talking about. So I think that both things have to be happening. So what we're talking about here, the CRLs and these approvals, we have to have a little more steadiness in this space, as well as some of the new programming that we're talking about. And then the other thing is we need to be talking about the accelerated approval pathway. It works in rare disease. It's critical in rare disease. There are some communities for whom the surrogate biomarker is the best way to understand what is happening in that rare disease community and is maybe the only way to detect what will be happening in that rare disease community. And so requiring that you detect a clinical outcome may not ever work for that community as the first measure. And so I think we need to not require clinical meaningfulness instead of a surrogate, but make sure we have the opportunity to have correlation for some populations. And so I think as a community, we need to continue to advocate for the potential for accelerated approval pathway in rare disease.
And I want to follow up to that, and I'll start with you, Annie, because I don't mind putting you right back on the spot. But it follows up to what you were just saying about accelerated approval, which is that it is an important tool for rare disease. And when we're talking about consistency and predictability, part of what is embedded in that message is some of these tools are being used in rare diseases, just not consistently and in a predictable way. And so for each of our panelists here, I wonder whether it's certain programs or pathways that you've already talked about or others that the agency has in its toolbox. Have you seen work for other communities, but are things that are maybe that predictability is breaking down when it comes to your community? But Annie, since a little bit of a follow-up on that accelerated approval point, have you start?
Well, I'll start with the accelerated approval pathway. I think Jessica shared some data showing that we're not seeing the approvals and using the accelerated approval pathway in rare, but we are seeing it in rare oncology. We did a study, or we funded a study that really looked at how the accelerated approval pathway is being used in the oncology space versus in the rare space. And I think one of the things that has hindered our ability to use the accelerated approval pathway in rare is that the surrogate markers in rare are always novel. because this is a new space for us. Whereas in oncology, what we found is that surrogate markers were used 5 to 7 times per approval. So it's a known entity in the oncology space and to reviewers, where in our space, it's new. And if you have new reviewers and new staff at the agency, this is going to be a novel space to be working in. So that really speaks to the need to also be funding and investing in pilots, such as the RDEA pilot that we had in the user fee agreements in PDUFA 7. So as we look to PDUFA 8, there are real opportunities to, again, support pilots that we have that we're working and are incredibly important in rare, because we need more endpoints in rare disease. We need more confidence. And I think what a lot of people don't realize is that oftentimes in rare disease, that surrogate is not agreed upon until the time of approval. So that's incredibly important too, because when you talk about consistency and predictability, you're asking a company and a community to be working in a very uncertain space until they get to the time of approval, if that's a surrogate that's never been used. So that would be a space that we really can think about. Are there upstream opportunities to get to an agreement around that surrogate that creates more confidence earlier on as well?
Yeah, we'll just go in reverse order this time. How about that?
Yeah, I mean, I would just kind of elaborate on that. And what I said earlier is, for example, the subtype of limb-girdle that my daughter has, we have 15 years of really beautiful natural history study data. 15 years of, it's been well controlled, it's been consistent at the same site at the University of Iowa. And again, to that point, when you have the first approval that used natural history study data with Friedreich's ataxia, and it was an accelerated approval using natural history study data as a control arm, it's the perfect example that we would love to model ourselves after, and yet it's still not consistently being used yet. And again, with these ultra-rare diseases that are muscle wasting every day, to have a patient that's on a placebo arm trial for 1.5 years, 3 years, even longer, it just seems completely unethical. So, but it's still happening. So I think it's just trying to make it more consistent, create a toolbox or create some sort of tools and mechanism that the companies that are doing this work feel comfortable and confident that their drug will not be CRL'd because the data isn't reliable or because it's not the traditional way that it's always been done. I think it's time to flip it and make it more consistent and give the confidence to the companies in the space.
So in Barr syndrome, we have roughly 150 Americans living with this syndrome today. If you think about that, that's really hard to do a randomized control trial. In a pre-approval space, and that's something I really want to acknowledge the administration for acknowledging. It's difficult. But if it's difficult in pre-approval, why should it be easy in the post-approval? It's not. And many times we have to go outside the country to achieve this. Multiple sites. It does not scale well for rare, and especially for ultra-rare. And that obviously introduces other challenges when you're trying to demonstrate efficacy in the post-approval setting. So that's something that, honestly, the design would give us concern going forward. The other piece here is, we've talked about natural history. But natural history, we've done that. We've looked at natural history, and still that was not sufficiently compelling for the FDA. That's an example of inconsistency. Why can you look at that with some but not all? Additionally, with 150 people, imagine designing a natural history, 10-year study, millions and millions of dollars. We don't have time to waste. We have to use the data that's available now. And part of that data is listening to patients and their experiential data, as Amy was mentioning. Another challenge are the endpoints. 6-minute walk test, it's a functional endpoint. We use that in Barr syndrome. It's been studied in other conditions. FDA didn't like it for us. So that subjectivity creates a lack of predictability. It's in theory, but endpoints have been used in other indications, but then you get to that endpoint, or at the end of the trial, and all of a sudden it's not good enough. Go back and redesign it. Do it again. We don't have time, we don't have money to do this. So really, when you think of efficient pathways that are predictable, that we can truly are feasible here in the United States, not going elsewhere to do this, so that people can access therapies sooner than later. An example
Sanfilippo syndrome, our biomarker heparin sulfate is well accepted. It's also the biomarker for Hunter syndrome as well, but unfortunately, both of those conditions have received delays in recent months. And so Congress gave FDA the flexibility to use surrogates, and they need to be using them. We know that accelerated approval works in HIV, in cancer, in other rare diseases. So just to echo others' points, we have to be using it.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone.
Can I say one more thing, James,
Of
quickly?
course, Emily.
Because I want to acknowledge last week, there was a great meeting on this, and I think there was acknowledgement that RCTs aren't necessary, but there is a willingness to look at alternative methods for evaluating new drugs in these small populations. And I do want to acknowledge Dr. Prasanna for making those comments.
And maybe, I mean, that might be a good place to say, last week was the first RISE workshop, which came out of the strategic agenda of the Rare Disease Innovation Hub, which many will remember was newly formed last year and implemented by this new administration of this agency. And so we are seeing, again, positive momentum, positive commitment to rare at the same time that we're seeing some negative trends coming out. So what we're really asking for is a commitment to existing infrastructure, existing timelines. And one of the things that is confusing to us is that as some of these new program announcements are coming out, and we've had about 3 in the past week, one of the questions we have is, well, what does that mean for programs that are already in process, for products that have already been submitted? Because many of these new programs require pre-specification before submission. So where does that leave those that are already at the beginning of the timeline that we showed? Where do they fall in? So those are some of the questions that we have for the agency as new announcements are being made. So we see that there's a commitment to rare, but there are a lot of questions that remain unanswered.
No, it's really important, and again, you know, what you're hearing from all of us is, you know, there's a lot of discussion, you know, that's all going in the right direction. You know, greater use of flexibility, greater use of single-arm study designs with natural history or baseline controls, greater use of flexibility even in, you know, statistics and traditional p-values, and especially in ultra-rare diseases where in some cases FDA has not required pre-specification and allowed more holistic review of data sets. But we're just not seeing that translate across the board, across the wide range of rare diseases. I do want to ask another question, and Annie, you're very good at you know, helping perfectly bridge to where I want to go, which is to transition a little bit from regulatory pathways and tools to, you know, get drugs to the market, but some of these programs and initiatives from the agency. And, you know, I would wonder, maybe there's 2 parts to this question, and feel free to react to either part, you know, but this point of having these programs complement and not replace existing programs. I think of, I mentioned in my remarks, the START pilot. You know, this is not something talked a lot about because there's only 7 programs involved in this pilot, but it's essentially Operation Warp Speed for rare diseases. You know, gives those 7 programs, you know, much more rapid and continuous engagement with the agency to be able to advance those programs. I have multiple clients that happen to be in that program and know that that program has been working quite well, you know, but when we have alphabet soup of 20 different rare disease programs, even the agency, you know, in the Rare Disease Innovation Hub, when it was created, acknowledged it's kind of confusing, and how do we navigate this? But as we are getting more of these initiatives, you know, what are your perspectives in terms of how this can help complement and not replace those existing programs? And maybe, is there something that we've missed? Is there something that actually we should be looking forward maybe in the next PDUFA to pilot? Emily, I'll put you on the spot this time to start.
Can you go first?
Sure.
Yeah, I can. I mean, as a community, I think we're just beginning to start to have the engagements and conversations about the next user fee framework. And I think it's the perfect time to be having those conversations. I think one of the things that especially in talking about analyzing programs like the START pilot and RDA, and I just spoke to RDA, that feels like a good opportunity to think about how do we ensure that we make that permanent and resource it more, because that really does speak to the need to have shore up opportunities for endpoints and surrogates. START is one of those that, for those that are in the program, they understand the program. But for those that haven't benefited from the program, there haven't been necessarily a lot of shared learnings from that program. So one of the things that the community has been talking about is how do we disseminate and share what has come from that program? Are there case studies and opportunities to share across the community, industry, and the patient community? What are the shared learnings from those programs before we can even make recommendations as to what else is needed there? And then as we are talking about user fees, I think a lot of the concepts we're talking about now really do fit into that user fee structure, so that vehicle actually fits really beautifully along with that. And maybe as we talk about sort of these delays that we're seeing, while we are really encouraging as much as possible having first cycle review decisions, if for any reason you can't wrap something up in the first cycle, then there should be some timeline associated with when decisions will be made and what happens next. And maybe that is something to think about in the context of user fee negotiations.
And as we are about at the top of the hour, I'll expand this even to just say if there's any kind of final point that you want to make, what's most important to your community. Now I'll give it to Emma.
All right, I'll go. Normally, I love to be grandfathered in. And I'm kind of sad I might miss the boat on the RDEP. Kind of want to see how that goes with the new policy that's been proposed by FDA. So we'll see how that plays out. Additionally, some of the things I think we're missing opportunities right now are on registries, especially for these small organizations and small communities. Dr. Persali had said, RCTs and pre-approval, post-approval might not be required. Registries are an untapped opportunity right now that I would encourage us to consider.
Jessica?
So we welcome anything that speeds up rare disease drug development. We, the RDEP announcement last week was pretty interesting. And, the commissioner is saying all the right things. We're excited about the things that he's saying. We just need to make sure that those are trickling down to the reviewers. And we need to make sure that these new programs don't divert resources or create confusion with existing programs, and that our children do not get left behind.
And I'm just going to fast forward, and I'm just going to think optimistically that each of our communities and beyond will eventually have an approved drug through the accelerated approval pathway. And I think just thinking next steps is how do we get those drugs covered and accessed, patients can access them, because we are hearing that there are insurers that are saying, well, we're not going to cover the cost of that drug if it's approved through the accelerated approval pathway. So I think sort of next step, I know that's not the topic at hand right now, but I just think that's something, once we get more drugs approved through this process, is making sure the patients can have access.
Thank you. Do you have a final thought?
Yeah. A lot of people in this room and a lot of members of Congress have really invested in the patient-focused drug development movement, which has been really heavily baked into PDUFA 5, 6, 7, and hopefully we'll see it in 8. And it's because of the expertise of the patient community. You're seeing it here in real time. And so I would just say that we want to make sure that we can continue to see that pulled through into our regulatory environment and into any legislation that we're moving forward. Exact reasons you're saying that patient experience and patient expertise needs to be involved from the very beginning of a clinical trial all throughout the regulatory environment and pulled through into the access environment. And we have those conversations all the time, but this is why. Everything you've seen here is why.
Yeah. So to conclude, I just want to really express gratitude for all of you who have come, given us your time, attention, and really your compassion to hear these stories from these communities firsthand. You're critical partners to the rare disease community, and we look forward to working with you to try to solve these problems together. So with that, please join me in thanking our great panel one last time.
My son was really tall.